The Yom Kippur War of 1973 did not begin with tanks crossing borders or jets streaking across desert skies, but with a slow, almost imperceptible accumulation of assumptions hardening into dogma as the Middle East settled into a tense post-1967 equilibrium that both sides mistook for stability, while beneath the surface, humiliation, strategic impatience, and Cold War rivalry quietly rewired the logic of deterrence into something brittle and dangerously self-confident. After Israel's decisive victory in the Six-Day War, the regional balance appeared fixed, with Israel occupying the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and other territories. Its military reputation transformed from regional actor to near-mythic force, while Egypt and Syria absorbed defeat that cut far deeper than the loss of land, striking at legitimacy, prestige, and the credibility of leadership itself. For Israel, 1967 reinforced a doctrine built on early warning, rapid mobilization, and decisive preemption, a belief that intelligence superiority would always provide sufficient notice, and that any future Arab attack could be blunted or crushed before it achieved strategic effect, assumptions that were gradually elevated from analytical judgments into near certainties. For Egypt, the aftermath of defeat produced a far different lesson, as years of diplomatic deadlock and military inferiority convinced President Anwar Sadat that time itself had become the enemy, and that without a dramatic disruption of the status quo, Egypt would remain trapped in humiliation, its economy strained, its alliance with the Soviet Union stagnant, and its political future constrained by a peace process that offered no leverage. Sadat did not seek total victory over Israel, a goal he knew was militarily unattainable, but rather a limited war designed to puncture Israeli complacency, restore Arab confidence, and force the United States to engage seriously in diplomacy, a strategy that depended less on battlefield conquest than on perception, timing, and controlled escalation. This approach unfolded within the larger Cold War framework, where the Middle East functioned as a volatile proxy arena, with Israel deeply embedded in the American strategic orbit, and Egypt and Syria reliant on Soviet arms, training, and political backing, yet where neither superpower desired direct confrontation, and both sought to preserve détente, even as they competed for influence. The paradox was that superpower restraint increased regional risk because local actors understood that Washington and Moscow would supply weapons and diplomatic cover, but would hesitate to intervene decisively, creating space for calculated aggression that could exploit the gray zone below nuclear escalation. Throughout the early 1970s, Egypt and Syria rebuilt their forces with Soviet assistance, not to replicate Israeli maneuver warfare, but to counter it, focusing on layered air defenses, anti-tank weapons, and carefully scripted offensive plans that aim to neutralize Israeli advantages long enough to achieve political effect. Israeli intelligence observed these preparations, but filtered them through a conceptual framework known as the concept, a deeply entrenched assessment that Egypt would not initiate war without first achieving air superiority, and that Syria would not act without Egypt. Assumptions reinforced by years of quiet borders and repeated Arab exercises that ended without conflict. This cognitive rigidity proved fatal, as Egyptian forces deliberately staged large-scale maneuvers along the Suez Canal to normalize mobilization patterns, training Israeli analysts to discount what would later be genuine preparations for attack, while diplomatic signals were crafted to suggest frustration rather than imminent war, lulling decision-makers into a false sense of predictability. The deception extended to timing itself, as Sadat selected Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, when Israeli reserve mobilization would be slowed and national attention diverted. A choice that magnified the psychological shock of surprise and exploited the very social rhythms that Israel assumed would never coincide with major conflict. On the morning of October 6, 1973, Israeli defenses remained on low alert, reserve units dispersed, and senior leadership divided between caution and disbelief, while across the canal, Egyptian forces prepared one of the most meticulously planned assaults in modern military history. When the attack came, it unfolded with stunning precision as Egyptian artillery barrages shattered Israeli fortifications. Assault units crossed the Suez Canal using portable bridges and water cannons to breach the Bar-Lev line, and surface-to-air missile umbrellas shielded advancing troops from Israeli air power, achieving in hours what years of stalemate had failed to deliver. Simultaneously, Syrian forces surged across the Golan Heights, overwhelming thin Israeli defenses and driving deep into territory seized in 1967, forcing Israel to confront the prospect of strategic defeat on two fronts at once. The opening hours of the war demolished assumptions across the region, as Israeli invulnerability evaporated under the weight of surprise. Arab forces achieved tangible success, and the carefully maintained balance of deterrence collapsed into chaos. For Israel's leadership, the shock was existential, as intelligence failure intersected with operational crisis, compressing decision-making into frantic hours marked by partial information, fear of encirclement, and the realization that the margin for error had vanished. Emergency mobilization orders went out, reservists rushed toward front lines under fire, and commanders committed understrength units to desperate holding actions designed to buy time rather than achieve victory. This improvisational phase of the war revealed how dependent Israeli security had become on warning and initiative, and how vulnerable even AI, technologically superior force, could be when surprised. While for Egypt and Syria, the early success validated years of planning and reinforced belief that controlled war could succeed where diplomacy had failed. As reports of the surprise attack reached Washington and Moscow, the conflict immediately acquired a superpower dimension that extended far beyond the battlefield, because the outcome now threatened to reshape regional influence, alliance credibility, and the delicate structure of détente itself. American officials faced the possibility that Israel, the cornerstone of U.S. influence in the Middle East, could suffer a humiliating defeat that would embolden Soviet-aligned states and undermine perceptions of American reliability, while Soviet leaders confronted the equally dangerous prospect that Arab success could spiral into uncontrolled escalation, or that Arab failure could expose Moscow's inability to protect its clients. Both superpowers were drawn into crisis management under conditions shaped by the memory of Cuba, where miscalculation had nearly triggered nuclear war, and by the recognition that regional conflict could now cascade rapidly into global confrontation. The Yom Kippur War thus began not merely as an Arab-Israeli clash, but as a systemic shock to the Cold War order, revealing how deterrence rested on assumptions that could collapse without warning, and how the interaction of regional ambition, intelligence failure, and superpower rivalry could compress decades of strategic stability into a matter of days, setting the stage for a conflict that would test not only armies in the desert, but the ability of the Cold War itself to contain the forces it had unleashed. As the first day of fighting bled into night, the Yom Kippur War entered a phase defined by panic beneath discipline and control layered atop improvisation, as Israel's military and political leadership confronted the collapse of the assumptions that had underpinned national security since 1967. Because the surprise attack had not merely breached defenses, but had ruptured the belief that intelligence dominance could substitute for strategic depth or margin for error. On the Golan Heights, Israeli units found themselves outnumbered and outgunned, fighting delaying actions against advancing Syrian armor in conditions where ammunition ran low. Communications faltered, and commanders were forced to make life-and-death decisions with incomplete situational awareness. While the threat of a breakthrough toward the Jordan Valley transformed the northern front into an existential battlefield where defeat could imperil the heart of the state. Reserve units, hastily mobilized, arrived piecemeal under fire, thrown into combat with minimal preparation as the Israeli Air Force struggled to provide close support against dense Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile networks that inflicted losses previously considered unacceptable, revealing how technological parity had narrowed the gap that once guaranteed Israeli dominance. In the Sinai, Egyptian forces consolidated their positions east of the Suez Canal, resisting Israeli counterattacks with disciplined infantry formations, armed with anti-tank weapons that devastated advancing armor, while their protective missile umbrella forced Israeli pilots to fly higher, strike less accurately, and accept attrition rates that challenged long-held assumptions about air supremacy. These battlefield realities generated profound psychological shock as Israeli commanders accustomed to rapid maneuver and decisive victory now confronted stalemate and vulnerability, forcing a recalibration of tactics in real time under relentless pressure. Within the Israeli cabinet, the gravity of the situation produced agonizing debates about mobilization, escalation, and survival, as leaders weighed the possibility that conventional defeat could threaten the state's existence and considered measures once regarded as unthinkable, including preparations to signal ultimate resolve if lines collapsed. Although such measures remained tightly held and never fully implemented, their discussion underscored how narrow the margin had become between conventional war and catastrophic escalation, and how quickly desperation could drive leaders toward the edges of the Cold War's most dangerous thresholds. As Israel fought to stabilize its fronts, the superpowers accelerated their involvement, drawn deeper by alliance commitments and the fear that inaction could alter the regional balance irreversibly. The Soviet Union initiated a massive resupply effort to Egypt and Syria, airlifting tanks, aircraft, and munitions in quantities designed to sustain the offensive and prevent collapse, while American intelligence tracked these movements with growing concern, interpreting them as signals of Moscow's determination to preserve credibility and influence in the Arab world. Washington faced an urgent dilemma as early hesitance to resupply Israel, driven by concerns about provoking Arab states and destabilizing oil markets, collided with intelligence reports indicating that Israeli losses were mounting and that failure to act decisively could lead to strategic defeat. This hesitation gave way to action as American leaders concluded that preserving Israel's military viability was inseparable from preserving American credibility, both regionally and globally, particularly in the context of Cold War competition, where allies everywhere watched how commitments were honored under pressure. Operation Nickel Grass, the American airlift to Israel, was launched as a visible demonstration of support, delivering weapons, aircraft, and ammunition directly into an active war zone, a move that transformed the conflict into a direct proxy confrontation between Washington and Moscow and dramatically raised the stakes. The airlift signaled that the United States was prepared to absorb diplomatic fallout and economic retaliation in order to prevent Israeli defeat, a calculation rooted in both strategic interest and the belief that allowing a Soviet-aligned victory would reverberate far beyond the Middle East. Moscow interpreted the American airlift as an escalation that threatened to tilt the balance decisively, reinforcing fears that Arab gains could be reversed through superpower intervention rather than battlefield outcomes, and intensifying pressure on Soviet leaders to respond in ways that preserved parity without triggering direct confrontation. This escalating cycle of action and reaction unfolded under the shadow of détente, exposing its fragility as cooperation on arms control and trade proved insufficient to prevent rivalry from reasserting itself when core interests were challenged. On the battlefield, Israeli forces gradually stabilized the Golan Front through costly counterattacks that halted Syrian advances and began to push enemy units back toward pre-war lines, a turnaround achieved through sheer concentration of force, rapid adaptation, and the willingness to absorb losses to regain initiative. This stabilization freed Israeli units for redeployment southward, where the focus shifted to breaking the Egyptian bridgeheads and restoring strategic balance in the Sinai, an effort that would demand daring maneuvers and risk escalation at every step. The war's second phase thus unfolded as a race between military recovery and political escalation, as each side sought to improve its position before external pressure forced a ceasefire, while superpower involvement compressed timelines and magnified consequences. Intelligence failures on both sides compounded uncertainty as assessments lagged behind rapidly changing realities, and leaders made decisions based on projections rather than facts, increasing the risk that misinterpretation could trigger disproportionate responses. The Yom Kippur War at this stage revealed the dangerous synergy between regional conflict and global rivalry, as tactical decisions on desert battlefields influenced nuclear postures thousands of miles away, and as alliance commitments transformed local reversals into tests of superpower resolve. Beneath the noise of artillery and diplomacy, a deeper lesson was emerging: that the Cold War's apparent stability had masked systems vulnerable to surprise and escalation, and that the management of crisis depended not on flawless intelligence or perfect deterrence, but on the capacity of leaders to recognize when control was slipping and to act before momentum carried events beyond recovery. As the conflict moved into its most dangerous phase, the Yom Kippur War became less about territorial control and more about preventing collapse, humiliation, or intervention, as Israeli recovery on the battlefield began to intersect with superpower fear of losing control over a war that was now testing the limits of Cold War crisis management. Having stabilized the Golan Heights through relentless counterattacks that pushed Syrian forces back toward their pre-war positions, Israel turned its attention southward, where Egyptian forces still held firm east of the Suez Canal under the protection of their missile defenses, creating a strategic dilemma in which Israeli leaders had to choose between attritional frontal assaults that promised heavy losses or a high-risk maneuver that could reverse the war's momentum but might provoke superpower escalation. This decision unfolded under extraordinary pressure as American support arrived but remained politically sensitive. Oil-producing Arab states signaled economic retaliation, and intelligence assessments warned that prolonged stalemate would favor Egyptian political objectives, even if Israeli forces eventually regained ground. The solution emerged in the form of a bold and precarious plan to cross the Suez Canal and strike at the operational depth of the Egyptian army, a maneuver that required exploiting a narrow gap between Egyptian forces and accepting enormous risk in exchange for decisive leverage. Israeli commanders understood that success could encircle Egypt's Third Army and transform the war's strategic narrative, but failure could expose forces to counterattack and deepen the crisis at a moment when national endurance was already strained. The crossing operation, executed under fire and with limited margin for error, marked a turning point in the war as Israeli units established a bridgehead on the west bank of the canal, disrupting Egyptian command and control and forcing Cairo to confront the possibility that early gains could be reversed into catastrophic defeat. This sudden reversal alarmed the Soviet Union, which now faced the prospect that its principal Arab ally might suffer a humiliating encirclement that would undermine Moscow's credibility across the developing world and expose the limits of Soviet protection. Soviet leaders responded with increasingly urgent diplomatic efforts, pressing for an immediate ceasefire and warning that continued Israeli advances could not be tolerated, even as internal debates intensified over whether more direct measures were required to prevent collapse. The United States, meanwhile, confronted a parallel crisis of control as Israeli success threatened to exceed Washington's political objectives by humiliating Egypt and destabilizing the region, potentially driving Arab states further toward confrontation and increasing the risk of Soviet intervention. American officials sought to restrain Israeli operations even as they continued to provide support, a delicate balancing act that reflected the contradictory imperatives of alliance management, crisis containment, and post-war diplomacy. These pressures converged in a moment of extreme tension when intelligence reports suggested that the Soviet Union might be considering unilateral action to enforce a ceasefire or stabilize the situation, including the possible deployment of forces to the region, a move that would have introduced direct superpower military presence into an active conflict zone. The prospect of Soviet intervention triggered alarm in Washington, where officials feared that failure to respond decisively could allow Moscow to alter the outcome of the war and establish a precedent for intervention that would reverberate across the Cold War landscape. In response, the United States raised its military alert level to DEFCON 3. Signaling heightened readiness and underscoring the seriousness with which American leaders viewed the unfolding crisis, even as they sought to keep the move largely secret to avoid public panic. This alert was not a step toward war, but a signal aimed at deterrence, relying on the assumption that Moscow would recognize the risk of escalation and step back rather than challenge American resolve. The effectiveness of this signal depended entirely on interpretation, on whether Soviet leaders would see it as a warning or a provocation, a gamble shaped by mutual suspicion and compressed decision timelines. For a brief and perilous period, the world stood on the edge of a confrontation where regional war, alliance credibility, and nuclear signaling intersected, and where miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. Intense diplomatic efforts followed, culminating in a United Nations brokered ceasefire that halted major combat operations and froze forces largely in place, preventing further escalation while leaving many issues unresolved. Even after the ceasefire, sporadic fighting and maneuvering continued as each side sought to improve its position before negotiations took hold, underscoring how fragile control remained and how easily violence could resume. The resolution of this phase of the war demonstrated that restraint prevailed not because systems functioned flawlessly, but because leaders recognized the catastrophic consequences of escalation and chose to step back from the brink, relying on diplomacy and signaling rather than force to contain the crisis. The Yom Kippur War thus reached its most dangerous moment not during the initial surprise attack, but during the phase when Israeli recovery threatened to transform limited war into total humiliation, and when superpower involvement compressed regional conflict into a test of global stability, revealing how narrow the margin between conventional war and nuclear confrontation had become. In the tense days following the ceasefire, the Yom Kippur War entered a phase where military action gave way to a prolonged struggle over interpretation, restraint, and control, as the immediate danger of escalation receded. but the systems that had brought the superpowers to the brink remained exposed and unresolved, forcing leaders in Washington, Moscow, Jerusalem, and Cairo to confront the uncomfortable reality that the war's most consequential battles were now diplomatic and psychological rather than kinetic. Egypt's Third Army, encircled yet not destroyed, became the focal point of this post-war crisis, its fate symbolizing the thin line between victory and catastrophe, as Israeli forces held positions that could sever supply lines and impose surrender, while American officials pressed urgently for restraint, recognizing that allowing the army's collapse would humiliate Egypt, destabilize the region, and invite renewed Soviet involvement. This dynamic revealed a paradox at the heart of Cold War proxy warfare, that success on the battlefield could undermine strategic objectives by provoking reactions that threatened broader stability, a lesson that reshaped how both superpowers viewed the management of Allied victories. For the Soviet Union, the ceasefire represented both relief and loss, as Moscow avoided direct confrontation, but saw its influence eroded by its inability to dictate outcomes, reinforcing doubts within the Kremlin about the reliability of military assistance as a tool of long-term leverage. These doubts were compounded by Egypt's increasingly independent posture, as Sadat leveraged the war's outcome to reposition his country diplomatically, signaling openness to American mediation and a willingness to break with the rigid alignment that had defined Cold War politics in the region. The United States seized this opening, recognizing that the war had created conditions in which incremental diplomacy could succeed where years of stalemate had failed, and moved swiftly to position itself as the indispensable intermediary, capable of delivering security guarantees, disengagement agreements, and economic incentives. The resulting diplomatic process, often described as shuttle diplomacy, unfolded against the backdrop of Cold War competition, but sought to reduce its intensity by addressing the local drivers of conflict, illustrating how systemic risk could be mitigated through political engagement rather than military dominance. For Israel, the post-war period was marked by introspection and institutional reckoning, as investigations into intelligence failure, command decisions, and civil-military relations exposed vulnerabilities that had been masked by earlier victories, prompting reforms aimed at restoring confidence without repeating the complacency that had preceded the war. This process underscored how shock and near defeat can catalyze learning within security systems, forcing adaptation that peacetime success often delays. Across the superpowers, the memory of the DEFCON 3 alert lingered as a warning about how quickly nuclear forces could be drawn into regional crises, reinforcing the argument for clearer communication channels, more predictable signaling, and renewed commitment to arms control mechanisms designed to prevent accidental or unauthorized escalation. The Yom Kippur War thus fed directly into broader Cold War debates about crisis management, highlighting the limits of deterrence when surprise, misperception, and alliance obligations intersected, and strengthening the case for negotiated frameworks that could slow escalation before it reached nuclear thresholds. Economically, the war's aftermath reverberated through the global system as the oil embargo imposed by Arab producers reshaped energy markets, triggered inflation, and demonstrated how regional conflicts could produce systemic shocks far beyond the battlefield, linking Cold War rivalry to economic vulnerability in ways that expanded the definition of security. This linkage forced policymakers to recognize that military decisions could have cascading effects across political and economic domains, complicating crisis management and amplifying the stakes of regional wars. As the immediate crisis faded, the Yom Kippur War came to be understood as a turning point, not because it resolved the Arab-Israeli conflict, but because it altered the strategic environment in which that conflict unfolded, shifting emphasis from decisive victory to managed confrontation, and from rigid alliances to flexible diplomacy. The war exposed the fragility of assumptions that had sustained Cold War stability, revealing how easily deterrence could fail when filtered through outdated frameworks and cognitive rigidity, and how survival depended on the willingness of leaders to reassess beliefs under pressure. In this sense, the war's legacy lies in its demonstration that the Cold War was not a static balance, but a dynamic system vulnerable to shock, where stability required constant adjustment rather than complacent reliance on past success, and where the greatest danger emerged not from deliberate aggression, but from the accumulation of rational decisions that, taken together, pushed events toward the brink of uncontrollable escalation. The longer shadow of the Yom Kippur War stretched far beyond the ceasefire lines and disengagement talks, reshaping how the Cold War understood risk, power, and control. By revealing that the most dangerous moments did not arise from deliberate plans for conquest, but from the collision of rigid assumptions with rapidly unfolding reality, as systems designed for deterrence proved incapable of absorbing surprise without generating escalation. For the superpowers, the war forced a reassessment of proxy conflict itself, demonstrating that regional allies could initiate wars for rational local reasons that nonetheless dragged Washington and Moscow into confrontations neither had sought nor fully controlled, compressing decision timelines and magnifying the consequences of misinterpretation. The Soviet leadership emerged from the war deeply unsettled, not only by the failure to prevent Israel's counteroffensive, but by the realization that its ability to influence outcomes through arms and advisors had limits, and that its threats of intervention, once a powerful tool, could now trigger nuclear signaling from the United States that placed the entire system at risk. This recognition intensified internal debates in Moscow about sustainability, as economic stagnation, technological lag, and the cost of maintaining global commitments collided with the sobering evidence that escalation could spiral beyond political intent. In Washington, the war reinforced a parallel understanding that alliance management required restraint as much as support, and that allowing partners to pursue maximal objectives could destabilize regions and invite superpower confrontation, a lesson that would shape subsequent American diplomacy by emphasizing leverage, mediation, and controlled outcomes over unconditional backing. Israel's experience became a case study in the dangers of overconfidence, as a state that had come to equate deterrence with invulnerability was forced to confront the reality that even overwhelming military superiority could not substitute for humility in intelligence assessment or adaptability in doctrine, embedding a culture of vigilance shaped by the memory of near catastrophe. Egypt's trajectory underscored a different lesson, that limited war could succeed strategically by altering perceptions and opening diplomatic doors, even without decisive military victory, validating Sadat's gamble and redefining how weaker states could navigate Cold War structures to achieve autonomy rather than permanent dependence. The war's impact on global systems extended into arms control and crisis management, as the DEFCON 3 alert joined a growing list of near misses that convinced policymakers the nuclear balance was becoming too complex, too automated, and too sensitive to external shocks to be left unmanaged, strengthening the case for mechanisms that could slow escalation and clarify intent. These insights fed into renewed efforts to stabilize superpower relations, reinforcing the logic that had underpinned earlier arms control agreements and foreshadowing later initiatives aimed at reducing ambiguity and lowering alert levels, even as rivalry persisted. Economically, The oil embargo transformed the war into a global event, exposing how regional conflicts could weaponize interdependence and create feedback loops between military decisions and economic stability. A development that expanded Cold War risk beyond the battlefield and forced governments to integrate economic resilience into strategic planning. The Yom Kippur War thus revealed the Cold War as a tightly coupled system, where shocks in one domain reverberated across others with unpredictable force, and where managing danger required holistic understanding rather than narrow focus on military balance alone. Historians would later see the war as a hinge moment, closing the era in which large-scale Arab-Israeli wars could unfold without immediate superpower. Brinkmanship and opening a period where diplomacy, arms control, and crisis communication became essential tools for preventing catastrophe. Yet this evolution was not driven by optimism or reconciliation, but by fear grounded in experience, by the recognition that the machinery of escalation had grown powerful enough to overwhelm even the most careful planners. The war's enduring warning lies in its demonstration that deterrence is not a guarantee, but a fragile condition dependent on accurate perception, timely communication, and the willingness of leaders to restrain both adversaries and allies when momentum threatens to carry events beyond control. In exposing how quickly stability could fracture and how narrowly catastrophe was avoided, the Yom Kippur War stands as one of the Cold War's clearest illustrations of systemic risk. A moment when rational decisions taken under pressure converged toward outcomes no one desired, and when survival depended not on superiority or ideology, but on the capacity of leaders to recognize the limits of power and to step back from the brink before the logic of escalation erased the distinction between regional conflict and global disaster. The final lesson of the 1973 Yom Kippur War is not found in ceasefire lines, disengagement maps, or diplomatic communiques, but in the stark exposure of how close the Cold War system came to catastrophic failure when regional war, alliance psychology, and nuclear signaling converged under conditions of surprise and mistrust, revealing that global stability depended far less on strength than on restraint, exercised at precisely the moment when pressure to escalate was greatest. The war demonstrated that deterrence, long treated as a static condition guaranteed by capability and reputation, was in reality a fragile process, vulnerable to deception, misinterpretation, and the inertia of assumptions that had hardened into doctrine. As Israeli intelligence certainty collapsed, Arab confidence surged, and superpower crisis management was forced into reactive improvisation rather than deliberate control. The DEFCON 3 alert, raised quietly to deter Soviet intervention, became one of the most sobering indicators of how narrow the margin had become between conventional war and nuclear confrontation. A reminder that escalation did not require intent, only momentum amplified by alliance obligation and fear of loss. Neither Washington nor Moscow sought direct conflict, yet both found themselves signaling nuclear readiness because local actors had created a situation where credibility, influence, and restraint appeared to pull in opposite directions. The war exposed the dangerous illusion that proxy conflicts could be insulated from superpower rivalry, showing instead that in a tightly coupled Cold War system, regional shocks propagated upward with alarming speed, compressing decision timelines and reducing opportunities for correction. Egypt's calculated gamble validated the power of limited war to reshape political realities, but it also demonstrated how such gambles could destabilize global systems by forcing superpowers into brinkmanship they had neither planned nor controlled. Israel's near defeat shattered the belief that military superiority alone could guarantee security embedding a permanent sense of vulnerability that would shape doctrine and civil-military relations long after the guns fell silent. For the superpowers, the war reinforced a grim understanding that nuclear arsenals had grown so vast and so sensitive that crisis management itself had become a core strategic function, as important as force structure or deterrence theory. This recognition fed directly into later efforts to stabilize the nuclear balance, not because leaders trusted one another, but because they feared the alternative. A world where miscalculation during regional wars could trigger irreversible escalation. The economic shock of the oil embargo further expanded the war's significance, demonstrating that Cold War conflicts could weaponize interdependence and destabilize global systems far removed from the battlefield, binding military decisions to economic consequences in ways that magnified risk and complexity. In retrospect, the Yom Kippur War stands as a hinge point where the Cold War briefly revealed its true nature, not as a controlled contest between superpowers, but as a precarious system prone to cascading failure when stressed by surprise, pride, and rigid thinking. Its enduring warning is that catastrophe was avoided not because the system worked as designed, but because individuals chose restraint under pressure, recognized the limits of escalation, and stepped back before momentum erased choice. In this sense, the war serves as one of the clearest demonstrations that survival in the nuclear age depended not on winning wars, but on preventing the machinery of deterrence from transforming rational conflict into irreversible disaster, a lesson paid for in blood, fear, and a fleeting glimpse of how easily the Cold War could have escaped human control.